Hey, this is Waylon from Swiftwood Bows, and welcome to part 3. So this is where, in my opinion, the process of tillering a bow starts, is establishing a good taper. You can save yourself a lot of time and a lot of anguish by establishing a nice line to follow. And honestly, with practice, this becomes a lot more intuitive, and a lot of times when I'm making a bow, I don't even draw myself out of line because I've made enough bows now that I can kind of just get a feel, like as I start taking off wood on the belly, where it needs to come off and where I need to leave it. You know, you can see, for instance, it's way thicker out here, so I would just be taking a lot of wood off here until it was down closer to this, and then, you know, taking it off more evenly. You know, we want to reduce all of the unnecessary bulk, but we don't want to take it too far. My goal when I'm establishing this initial taper is to get the bow to the point where I can get it to flex a little bit when I'm pushing it into the ground like this, or floor tillering it. I don't want it to go past that point because I haven't really been doing any fine tuning with the tiller yet, and I want to have control over that process. So what you can do, here, let me say a little bit more about this. So here is our fade, here's our handle, and here is our other fade. Now, the bow's going to be thick in the handle, and it's going to go down from the handle, from the fade, so that it can go into the working limb. And there's no, like, we can do precise measurements for the back of the bow, in terms of how wide we want the handle, how wide we want the fades, all of that. We have a pretty mathematical design in mind. But when it comes to the thickness of a bow, you can't use math on a self bow to decide how thick to make your initial line. Every piece of wood is different, and so we're gonna excuse me, we're gonna err on the side of caution, and we're gonna make it a little bit thicker than we think we'll need it. So I'm gonna kind of brace my hand here against the edge of the bow, and I'm gonna go from thicker here coming out of the fades down to a little bit thinner out here at the tips. So it's about an inch thick here, and on a American flat bow style, it's going to taper a little bit more dramatically than it would if it was a pyramid style, which goes from from wide straight down to narrow at the tips. It doesn't maintain the full width like a American flat bow does. So if the taper's not happening much in the width, then it needs to happen more in the thickness. If you're interested in more details about the concept behind tillering, I have a couple videos up talking specifically about tillering, and I encourage you to watch those before you move forward with your build if you're not feeling confident about those ideas. So to make this rough line, I'm going to brace my hand here against the back so that, I mean, this bow doesn't have a lot of contours on the back, but if it did, I would want my hand to follow those contours so that the belly could follow the back. And so ever so slightly as I go along, ever so slightly, I'm going to be closing the gap between my fingers and the line, just to give me that rough taper. So that by the time I get down to the end, it's a little closer to 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to have to use my judgment as I'm roughing out the thickness. I like to pause every once in a while and test the bow and see how it's bending. I don't want to just rip straight down to that line without any consideration, because like I said, every piece of wood is different, and my goal is to get it where it's just slightly bending, so that I can start fine-tuning the tiller in a more conscious way. So thick at the handle, an abrupt, well, a smooth but significant decrease down to the working limb, and then a really gradual transition down to thinner down here towards the tips. So I'm going to do that on every side here and try to get it pretty much the same, as close as I can. So I'm going to go from thick at the handle down to about 1 inch, and then really gradual. Alright, so this is about what it would look like when I was done. It gives me a rough guide to start removing wood from the belly. And if this was really thick, I would consider using a hatchet, but it's not that thick and I don't want to risk it, so I'm just going to start right in with the draw knife. Again, watching out for tearing out the grain. You know, if I ever feel like I'm at risk of that, I stop and I switch over to the rasp. Alright, I'm going to start the draw knife. I like to attack the corners first. There's a little knot. You can work it down to a ridge in the middle and then take the ridge away. It's a lot more efficient that way. If you're just scraping on the flat surface, it's just going to take you longer. See, I got to be careful here with the tear out. There's a couple knots down here, so I think I'm going to kind of pick at it with the draw knife to get as much bulk as I can off safely, but ultimately switch over to the rasp to take care of these 2 knots. I'm hoping that especially this knot is going to be largely gone by the time I'm ready to brace the bow. I'm planning on putting some reflex in this bow, and this is a bit of a troublesome place to have a knot for that because I'm going to be bending the wood that way with heat, and I don't want trouble from that, but I think it's going to be mostly gone by that point. So I try not to go too crazy on the getting the tips thin at this point. If they're a little bit bulky out here, it's not going to hurt anything until the bow is really ready to shoot. It's okay if it's a little stiff out here. During the early tillering process, I've made the mistake of getting them too close to the final thickness early in the early stages and finding that they're too thin and ending up with a lighter weight bow than I would have liked in the end. So, you know, it's okay to keep your tips chunky for a little while in the early part until you get a better idea of what you want your bow to be like. A big chunk of that knot. Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty much gone by the time we're done. Alright, I got the side with all those knots done. That knot completely popped out. I don't think it's going to trouble us anymore. As you can see, I didn't get quite all the way down to the line. Still plenty thick, but like I said before, I like to give it a few test bends just to see where it's at before I really reduce it down. I'm going to work on this side a little bit just so you can see some more uninterrupted draw knifing without all those knots in the way. Take advantage of this time when the bow's really thick to be really aggressive. Probably only took me about 5 or 6 minutes to get that other side down to where it was. Especially with you, this draw knife just tears right through it. If you're working with something like hickory or elm or hop hornbeam or something like that, expect to spend a little bit more time in this stage. Once again, just like when I was using the hatchet, I want to start here at the tip and work my way up so that I don't tear into something up here and rip down through past where I want to go. Okay, just finishing up this last section here near the handle. Got another knot to work around here. I need to be careful. I can feel the grain wanting to tear out near it. I'll just leave that for the rasp. Alright, let's give this a little test bend and see where we're at here. So that sound is scary, but all it is the bark popping off the U. So you'll notice that when I laid out the bow, the bark was still on there. I like to take the bark off really carefully, and that's going to be the next step here. I just like to get it to floor tiller so some of it starts to pop off. Yeah, it's a little startling at first when you're not expecting it. to hear that sound when you start bending your bow. But it's only the bark. Now, if you're working with a stave that already has the bark off and you hear that sound, then you should be worried. But if your bow starts breaking during floor tiller, you should thank it, because it's saving you a lot of time and heartache. Because right now, this is not a bow, this is just a stick of wood, and if it breaks now, then it was never meant to be. So I'm getting some flex. This is right about where I want it to be with that rough tapering, because now I'm going to start paying closer attention and really using my hands to be the guide for what needs to come off. Right now, my hands are telling me that this area is a little thin compared to out here. So I'm going to, and you can see, still have some above my line here, whereas I'm down closer to my line here. So the line was just to get me close, but now I need to start paying attention to what the wood is actually doing. And so my next step here is just going to be hunting down these really obvious thick spots and getting them to conform to the overall taper that I'm looking for, making sure that this edge is matching this edge. Like right now, this edge is a little thinner than this edge, so I want to correct that. If you're paying close attention at this stage and looking for these obvious issues in the taper, you're going to have a lot less surprises further down the road when you're actually bending the bow. So it pays to start paying attention at this stage. Since the bark is already starting to pop off, this is a good time to talk about removing the bark on this yew. And this technique could work on any wood that you've got bark on that you're going to use the first layer of wood right under the bark as your backing. You don't want to do anything that's going to nick up or damage this pristine backing that's under the bark. So I'm going to share a technique that I've worked out. It may not be the best or the most efficient. If anybody else has any ideas that work for them, I'm all ears, but this is what works for me. It can be a little painstaking and tedious, but it leaves me with a pristine back, which is important. So I went in the house and I've got a kettle of water boiling. I'm going to starting to boil. I'm going to use that in a bit, but before I'm ready for that, I need to rip down through the outer bark and leave a thin layer of the cambium. I don't want to cut through the cambium to get down to the actual sapwood, so I'm going to be going kind of slow and careful with the draw knife. So you can see the outer bark is very thin on you, and there's this kind of brownish inner bark. And what I want, my goal here is to be getting most of this cambium, most of this inner bark off, but if I see a white patch show through, that means that I have gone too far. So that's just about perfect. I'd just seen the barest hint of pale peeking through there. I don't want to cut into the back. Not going to worry too much about this knot out here. So I'm just using the lightest possible touch with a sharp draw knife to scrape away that outer bark. And I can use this, I'm going to use a card scraper to get even closer to the sapwood without actually touching it, hopefully with my tools. It would be tempting to grab with the draw knife right here where the bark is already popped away, but in reality I'm just going to end up gouging up the back trying to do that. Tried it in the past and didn't work so hot. I'd be careful around knots because the sapwood stands a little proud around them. I just touched it right there. And this is why I really wanted to get down to my line everywhere, because now my lines are disappearing, and I'm just going to have to trust the shape that I established with the bow. Alright, I'm going to, before I do the other limb with the draw knife, I'm going to go grab my scraper and show you how far down I want to get. So don't get in a hurry with this if you care about having a clean back. So I start to get little light patches coming through. And that's when I want to stop with the scraper before we move on to my secret weapon, which is the next tool I'll use. Maybe this is an important time to bring this up. So if you're working with yew is toxic, and especially the cambium and the sapwood dust, you don't want to be breathing in a lot of it. They use yew bark to make Taxol, which is used in chemotherapy. So I'm outside, there's a good cross breeze going, I'm not doing any sanding, so I'm being mindful of the dust that's getting kicked up, but I'm not too worried about this level of it. But if I was inside, I'd be wearing a dust mask, and I always wear a dust mask when I'm sanding yew. So just bear that in mind, and if you want to err on the side of caution, you can wear a dust mask the whole time you're working with it, because any scraping or rasping is going to kick up some amount of dust. It's not something to take super lightly, so just use your discretion on that. Alright, I'm going to keep working this down the side with the scraper, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then I'll show you the next step. Got the bark off and the cambium down till it's just like a really thin little fuzzy layer here over the sapwood, and here is my secret weapon. I'm just going to use a basic spoon. This plane fly over here. So I'm just going to use a spoon to scrape off the cambium, but it's not going to work with this dry stuff. It's too tough. So I'm going to combine the spoon with some boiling water. So I'm going to pour some boiling water over a section of the back here. And watch how it comes off now. Alright, I gotta stand on this thing here. It just comes right off. it doesn't take long for it to harden back up. So sometimes I have to work an area a couple times with some water and then the spoon again. But the spoon is not sharp enough to do any damage to the sapwood underneath. It's just taking off the soft inner bark. And you don't have to worry about the water soaking into the wood enough to change the moisture content. This is all pretty superficial and not even ready to be bending the bow yet. So I'll bring the stave inside overnight where it's warm and dry, and this water isn't going to be an issue. And because it's boiling, most of it's evaporating off pretty quickly anyway. And you can see that with a little bit of scraping with the spoon, you get a clean, perfect back that isn't violated at all. Some areas are a little bit more stubborn than others. Like I said, this is a bit of a tedious process, but the end result is pretty nice. And for me, it's worth the extra effort to not have a back that's all gouged up, because as careful as you are with the draw knife or the scalpel or the scraper, you can't get the bark off without damaging the back. So I'm going to keep going down the bow like this until all the bark is off. It's tempting to leave little bits as you go, but now's your best chance to get it perfectly clean without much hassle. Coming back later, it's just going to be more difficult to get this stuff off, so take your time and get every little bit off. I'll work on that end in a little bit here. Alright, I'll show you what it looks like when I'm all done. I've got the bark taken completely off. You can see that the back is pristine. There's no gouges, no scratches, no violated growth rings. The ends are kind of a pain, especially with this knot here, but I'm not worried about that. I'm going to be reducing it for a tip overlay anyway. But the bow is ready to start floor tillering. Taking off those thick spots, bending it a little bit more, feeling the taper. So we will do all of that on the next video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. We'll make this into a bow.